Today, I'm going to talk about how unlimited skepticism destroys everything. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So there are a bunch of different ways of defining skepticism, and they all come out to the same thing for the sort of thing that I'm talking about, which is not a novel point or something that anybody who's ever thought deeply about the nature of knowledge or skepticism hasn't encountered. I'm just going to come at this from a little bit of a different angle that may help to illuminate things a little differently. So any of them will work. So I'm just going to go with defining skepticism essentially as asking the question, is it true? Or how do we know that it's true? And skepticism is an extremely useful tool. There are times when it is appropriate to trust somebody, but there are lots of times when it isn't appropriate to trust somebody, and you should ask the question, okay, is this true? And then, ask the next question you have to ask is to follow up with, well, how do we tell whether or not it is true? Now, I should mention, by the way, that this video is not at all directed towards people, especially the sort of people who tend to call themselves skeptics in a modern context, because those sort of people mostly just, all they're really doing is applying unmeetable evidentiary criteria to things they don't want to believe in. They're not actually skeptical in any meaningful or important sense. So this is not about them. This is not addressed to them. They shouldn't be watching this. This is more about the question of, or the problem of, how you apply this sort of question. Because it's important to ask, is this true? How do we know that this is true? To, all manner of things. But equally importantly, if you were to come to any knowledge, that process has to have a termination point. It's got to stop. And you have the problem of essentially a potentially infinite recursion. That is to say, so, if you want to ask, some sort of question about how do we know this is true? So, you can ask this thing weighs 200 pounds. Okay, how do we know that? And you can decide a really, really naive approach, of course, obviously would be well, I tried to pick it up and it feels really heavy. Okay, but maybe you're just weak. How do we know that you're calibrated well? Okay, so perhaps we can figure out your calibration, or perhaps we use something that is easier to verify the calibration of, like a scale. So we take, you take a balance beam of equal length, etc., put the weight. But the thing is, you can apply recursively as you're doing this, the same question. So suppose you use balance beam, right? Fulcrum, balance of equal thing, you put a thing known to be 200 pounds on one side, the thing on the other, and if they balance, it weighs 200 pounds. Fine. But you can still apply this question recursively, well, how do we know the lengths are actually equal? And, because the thing is, it needs to be solid, so it's not like you can go and just, cut it in half and line the two of them up, because then it ceases to actually work as a fulcrum. So you can say, I can use a measuring tape and measure both sides. And then you can say, okay, but how do we know that the measuring tape actually gives the same results for the same thing? You might be stretching it. And you can, for any time you try to figure out the current question, you're going to be using some sort of means to do this. And then you can always apply to that means the question, okay, but how do we know that that means actually produces that intermediate result that we want? He's really, really wants to explore everywhere, and he'll knock things over, so I just kind of have to hold him at the moment. Anyway, so this problem, so essentially you have to be able to terminate this kind of question if you're ever to come to knowledge. You can, if you just apply it, if you apply it without end, you are never going to, since it can be asked about everything, you're never going to come to any knowledge, because anything that could possibly ground the knowledge, you just go and ask about that, what's grounding it. And so the problem with, I'm hoping everyone's going to catch this reference, the problem with it being turtles all the way down is that, well, you never get to the last turtle. And as such, since you never get to the last turtle, you never get to a grounding, and you never get to, well, knowledge. So this poses a problem. We have to, at some point, stop asking this question, but how do we know it's true? Which means, incidentally, so this is the same problem, essentially, is that all discursive knowledge needs to be grounded in noesis, the Greek word for direct knowledge. That if you're to have any kind of knowledge whatsoever, it has to be some sort of direct knowledge that is accepted directly rather than proved. It's not precisely the same thing, by the way, as having axioms. Axioms, I mean, for one thing, axioms are really more... axioms are abstract, and axioms are things that you take as simply true without proving. But an axiom does not, of its nature, mean that you actually think the thing is genuinely true. And it is not the case that to have knowledge, you have to just assume something, anything. In order to have knowledge, your mind has to have some sort of connection to reality. And that connection to reality becomes the direct knowledge, which is the foundation that all other knowledge can be built upon. So now we have it within the relatively recent Western tradition, by which I mean the last 400 some odd years. Largely the attempt, in a sense, ever since Martin Luther introduced the radical doubt that has been, one of the, sort of the rest is the West has been wrestling with ever since. When I say radical doubt, what I really mean is the radical need for certainty, or the need for radical certainty. But you see this addressed in Descartes, where in what was it called? I can't remember. And then Meditations on First Philosophy, where he expanded in it. Discourse on Method, I think it was, and then Meditations on First Philosophy, where he expanded. Descartes wrestles with this problem of how do we know anything at all, and something you have to bear in mind. He's famous for his for the proof of God that he invokes. One of the ways he improved in Discourse on Method from in Meditations on First Philosophy from his earlier Discourse on Method is his earlier proof of God was essentially what is it? It's I can't remember the name of it. There's some medieval friar who he sort of vaguely adapted and gave a not wonderful version of. I think it's St. Anselm's proof, actually. I'm not certain of that. Which has to do with the highest thing that you can think of, or the most perfect thing that you can think of, something along those lines. And nobody really was very satisfied with that proof. He gave a little bit better version of it in Discourse on Method, and that said, or you can just go from the argument from contingency and necessity. Though he didn't do it quite in those terms, he actually presented it. But he's man, if that doesn't convince you, then he gave an actually good proof for God. But that's actually not at all even slightly the point of either Discourse on Method or Meditations on First Philosophy. The actual point of these things is to ask stuff like, how can you trust your sense data even slightly? He's trying to establish essentially the grounding of things in empirical science. So if you want to base science on observations, how do you know your observations are worth a warm bucket of spit? To use the popular colorful metaphor. And so the problem, of course, is that your senses could be continuously and consistently fooled. And so he needed to go to, he needed God and God's goodness and God's governance of the world to guarantee that your senses are not actually being consistently fooled in all cases, because, well, otherwise there really was no other way of doing it. And because you can't appeal to the senses to show the senses aren't fooled, because by hypothesis, there are things being fooled. So you can't go to sense data to verify sense data. That's just circular reasoning. So he had to go outside of that. And, hence why he went to his proofs for the existence of God. But that wasn't the point. That wasn't the point at all. His point essentially was to say, how can we ground any kind of actual knowledge of the world so that we can actually, believe it? How can you believe that you have a next door neighbor, or that there is a ground or a sky or anything like that? So the answer to that question, though, so Descartes essentially, he was essentially answering a question that nobody had really asked. And you can argue as to whether or not this was actually his way of introducing the question. Did Descartes mean well or badly? Is an interesting question about Descartes, but we'll set it aside. Because that's not pertinent to the moment. So in order to actually ground knowledge, you can more or less I mean, Descartes did exactly saying that there is actually noesis, noetic knowledge, in a more like anglicized version of this. That is to say that direct knowledge does in fact exist. And he had to go and invoke God's goodness and governance of the world in order to justify why you can possibly believe that direct knowledge is possible. And he's not, really wrong in that. But you can take direct knowledge simply as not precisely an axiom, but a thing which you are convinced of by your experience of it. It's not actually, as Descartes will show, it's not actually very rationally defendable. Like not it's certainly not empirically defendable. It's not very rationally defendable other than by going and invoking God's governance of the world, basically. But it is always possible to simply start a little bit later and not ask how it's defensible and assume it, but not merely like assuming it for the sake of fun, in the same way that like mathematical axioms sometimes can be assumed purely for the sake of the fun of working out what are the consequences of this axiom. There's several axioms that most mathematics is built on because basically people hold them to be noetically true, but it is by no means necessary to do it. And there are people, back when I was in grad school for math, set theorists were kind of like this, and they were kind of, someone jokingly described them as essentially like the wild men running naked in the bushes within the mathematics world, doing all sorts of utterly crazy things, including, like one of them is holding that you... like looking into like what sort of mathematical systems can you build from contradictory axioms, and there are things like one of the, just to give you a sense of the flavor of it, and then I'm going to move on. One of the approaches was to find what is the shortest proof to a contradiction from within your within your axioms, and then disallowing all proofs of that length or longer, which is a very interesting sort of approach. That it is perfectly fine to hold axioms in that sort of fashion for the sake of thinking them through. So that's why I'm holding the distinction between simply having axioms and having axioms which you believe are true for some reason. Essentially, more or less, you have to, and you're going to be grounding an axiom in noetic knowledge. You're going to hold, like, I just know this is true. This appears to me to be an accurate description of reality. And the other approach, I will mention just briefly, the other approach that can be, it doesn't actually work, but it can sort of be viable in a practical sense, which is roughly speaking to hold that there is no such thing as science and everything is engineering. No one phrases it this way, of course, but that's what they actually mean. I'm describing it this way so that you, to make it easier to understand it as I describe it the other way. More in terms of the way it's described is that, like, well, we live in the world of sense experience and it appears to be consistent, so we're going to just place our bets that it is in fact consistent, because you have to do something. Why isn't stated, but you have to do something. And so, because you have to do something, the best bet to place is that the things that have remained consistent will, in the past, will remain consistent in the future. Now, this doesn't actually get around the problem really at all, because you are holding, still noetically speaking, that your memory is actually accurate. And you have no reason. I mean, how do you prove your memory is accurate? You're going to have an incredibly hard time of proving your memory is accurate without relying on memory, since memory is the only thing you have that crosses time. So, by the way, just super quickly, if someone is going to try to like set up video evidence or something, if you actually were to bother thinking this through, the problem is you would be meeting this in the present and can't rely on your memory that anybody even set up a video. And the fact that like the world accords in its current state with your memories of the past doesn't really mean anything, because your memories could be generated from the current state of the world and constantly changing, and you have no way of knowing this because you're relying on your memory to know what you had remembered before. So, relying on memory in any fashion whatsoever, which essentially that type of argument of, we're going to bet on these patterns because they're what we've seen, is still basing your system on noetic knowledge. It's just the noesis that you're using is more or less your memory of things. The point of all this is essentially that we all have to, unless we completely abjure all knowledge, And nobody actually does in practice. We all have to base our idea of knowledge on some sort of direct knowing. And so, since you're going to be doing that, it's worth spending some time and thinking about wherein consists our direct knowledge. What does our direct knowledge consist of? Because if you don't actually think this through, all you're going to do is to have some like haphazard pieces, or to quote G.K. Chesterton, that you're not going to even have the advantage of the brute beasts and have no philosophy. You're going to have the used up scraps of somebody else's philosophy. So it's worth thinking that through, because you cannot actually in practice be an unlimited skeptic. It doesn't work. And so you have to figure out, like, how are you going to transition from skepticism to knowledge? You need to be a skeptic at least part of the time. You can't, it is obviously unworkable to simply hold that all knowledge is simply direct knowledge, because amongst other things, human testimony obviously isn't. Like, somebody told you there exists a particle collider in Europe, but like, that's just somebody telling you. You don't have a direct knowledge of that particle collider. And it would be absurd to hold that human testimony is direct knowledge. So, if somebody tells you that they've conducted a bunch of experiments where they, throw projectiles and use Newton's calculations to see where they would land, and then, found that they actually landed there, unlike what you typically find in high school physics classes. I still remember quite vividly how... like when we're doing the experiments in high school physics class, to try to come up to actually for ourselves calculate the gravitational constant that, as I recall, people tended to get between about 2 meters per second and 7 meters per second squared, both cases. Like the number of people who actually check Newton's laws of physics and find them to be correct is, as far as I know, a very small number compared to the number of people who believe them to be correct. I can't recall ever having met anybody who actually did a collection of ballistics tests and actually, like, found that the answers showed that Newton's formulas were all correct. Nobody even, like, here's the thing, in practice, nobody does this either. Like the other way, you don't use Newton's laws and assume them to be correct. There are too many intruding factors always. So, like snipers, for example, like, Newton's laws of motion are a starting point, but, like, you have to do things like just find, you have to basically take test shots. Like, you do a whole lot of calculations and really, really hope you're close, because you don't want to take a lot of test shots, but, like, you just have to take test shots in order to find out where your bullet is going to hit, and then, essentially figure out how you walk yourself in. That's like the actual practice. Like, people who actually really want to hit targets use some sort of iterative approach where they try to get close and then correct it. So whether you're using, multiple shots of ballistic projectiles, or you're using guided projectiles where you can tell them where they're going and have them get closer, or, things in between too, where you figure out, you guide them, but, like, you get correction factors. Like, that's the thing. In practice, no one actually uses these things. So, like, the number of people who actually truly verify them, not say, like, yeah, they're kind of close, but, like, actually verify them is really quite tiny. Just a fun fact to consider. That sort of highlights the importance of what I am talking about. This is in no way... we also know that Newton's laws are wrong. That's the whole point of relativity, is that Newton's laws are wrong for any system that involves mass. So, the difference between, like, the amount that Newton's laws are off is often extremely small and below our threshold of the ability to measure. But, like, the extra terms don't disappear when you have low mass. They just, contribute only to, like, very far out decimals. But anyway, be that part as it may, the point is, very few people ever verify these things, and even the people who do, since they're a tiny minority, the rest of us are simply trusting them when they testify that they actually did try it out and it actually worked. And so I think that illustrates very well this point, that we need to figure out how we are going to, like, where we terminate our skepticism. Because we don't have time, and we don't even have the theoretical ability to question everything. Not enough you want answers. I mean, you can question things simply because you don't feel like believing in them. That's trivial and easy. You can disbelieve in the sky if you want to. You just keep on saying like, but how do you know that's true? And then eventually the person will just give up and leave, and you can claim victory that no one's proved to you the sky is real. Very doable. So the question comes up then, like, what is the texture? Now, I mean, to some degree, this is a complicated answer, and this to a great degree is the question of like, how are you wise? What is wisdom? Because of course, like the answer to how much should you how far should you push this is really, it's going to depend on the particulars of the whole thing. And a wise man will push it to the correct amount, and a fool will push it either too little or too far. But it is an important thing to consider, because we live in an age which is so influenced by Martin Luther's radical desire for certainty. And we also live in an age where people really, 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 really want to be conformist. Now, I think by and large that's mostly just human nature, with minor amounts of more individualism or less individualism. I think human nature isn't fixed, but the desire to conform to our fellow humans is very strong in pretty much all cultures. So that influences people to really, really want things that everybody will agree upon, which is why they're called empirical, but it's not. It's actually because empirical means like a thing that you can verify with your senses, and so that rules out things like electron microscopes, because you can't possibly verify it with your senses, and you've got a machine which you are reasoning is providing an image of whatever small thing is in front of it, but empiricism would absolutely things like optical microscopes and telescopes are iffy under empiricism. Things like electronic telescopes and things like electron microscopes are simply ruled out by empiricism. This is just straight up not empirical. You are not using your senses. You're not using your senses augmented by something. You have a machine that you reason about the properties of, and that like the thing that you are looking at is in fact a good representation that the machine is producing of what it sees, but you have absolutely no way of verifying this using your senses. And the thing is, electron microscopes are, in terms of the type of psychological phenomenon I'm talking about measurement, just fine. So really, it's not empirical, not in the proper sense of the word empirical. It's rather It's rather about things that can be objectively measured. So the thing that like people really, really like is things where, and an objective measurement is simply a thing where everybody will actually agree. There's very little that people will agree on, but for the most part, for example, if you are putting two weights on a balance beam and it balances, most people will agree that it is balanced, and if it's off balance, most people will agree that it is not balanced. If you take a tape measure and measure something, most people will agree how long the thing is, like how, if you hold the tape measure up and so on, virtually everybody will agree that the thing you're measuring is basically this long. If you count a number of things, like, people can make mistakes, obviously, in measurement, but nobody, like, virtually nobody will fundamentally disagree. Virtually nobody, without making mistakes, will say that there are different things in front of them. Now, there's lots and lots of things in this world where people will say that there are completely different things in front of them. And these are the things largely that the modern temperament really, really hates. So, these also are very frequently the more important things. So, like, for example, was an action murder or justified homicide? Incredibly, phenomenally important. And people can look at the identical set of facts and come to different conclusions about what the thing that they just witnessed was. That's not a measurable thing, because measurement to a great degree is you can turn it into a measurement, like number of murders. you're counting the number of murders. But the problem is it's not measurable in that psychological sense of everybody looking at it, if they get the same kind, same vantage point, same lighting, etc., will agree as to what it is they actually saw. Like, they will agree to a count of things if you have enough time and it's frozen, it's not moving, and so on. They will agree to a count of number of 1 pound weights on the balance beam. They will agree to a count of the number of feet marked off on the ruler. So in the modern world, people have a very, very strong psychological preference for things that have that property, the things that anybody, if they have the same experience, will agree as to what it was they experienced. And a lot of that, as I said, comes from several things. It is, and you can see very much the footprints of fingerprints of Martin Luther's desire for radical certainty. And it appeals to us as social animals. It also appeals to us very much. It's harder to doubt other people than it is to doubt yourself. It's hard to doubt everybody else than it is to doubt yourself. So, because you can always doubt yourself and wonder what you did, but if everybody around you agrees, it is just so psychologically powerful. Very few people have the ability to doubt something that everybody around them is saying is the case. If they're uniformly saying it in the same way, meaning the same thing, etc. Hence measurements in this kind of sense, and why they're so psychologically powerful. And there is real value to measurements. One of the other things, too, that measurements tie into, which is why people like them but doesn't really have much in the way of epistemological value, is that measurements also allow you to... they give you data with which to think abstractly, because abstract thought has to be simple in comparison to the real world. The very nature of abstractions, it's sort of like a simple model of a much more complex thing, but it's radically simple in all cases. We cannot think very complex thoughts. In point of fact, one of the first things, if you're teaching somebody how to do mathematics or teaching somebody how to do engineering of various kinds, or programming, is human beings can't solve complex problems. We can only solve simple problems. And so the most important thing to being a good programmer, engineer, mathematician, etc., is the ability to take complex problems that you can't do and break them down into simple problems that you can, that when you put those simple problems together, amount to a solution to the complex problem. So, now we can't solve these things analytically. For example, we are really good at computing, we can, just by looking, compute a parabola. So that's the essence of juggling, is that you see the very top of the ball's motion and you know where it is going. You can project that down, that parabolic arc, into where it's going to hit, so you can place your hand there without having to look at the ball on the way down to your hand, because you have to be looking at the other ones. And so you can do this. You can elevate where you can only see this much of the ball trajectories as you're juggling, and you can juggle just fine. And our brains are actually really good at computing that. And that's a complex problem. You have, you're solving for a collection of terms and then computing essentially in some sense the x-intercepts. Although it's even more complex than that. And to do that analytically, you have to deal with the squared term on its own, and then you deal with the multiplication of whatever's in front of the squared term. And then you deal with the multiplication on the linear term. And then you add two of these things together, and then you add the other two things together. In order to do it analytically, you have to break it down to these super, super simple problems. Whereas you actually are capable of solving the entire thing all as just one thing if you're not doing it analytically, but doing it intuitively, rather. And, seeing the ball's motion and knowing where the ball is going to be and when the ball is going to be there. So that's not by the way, meant to be the difference between analytic knowledge and noesis, but it is a good example of, it's a good lead-in point of fact, to sort of measuring out the nature of noesis. What things do we know? So a lot of people want to leave noesis simply at measurable things. For the reasons I had just described. But in point of fact, there are a lot of things that we know, and know much more complexly and instantly. But the problem there is that you get a lot less agreement to it on the more complex things. And part of this is human fallibility, and part of this is just human experience and so on. basically all competent jugglers will agree, like having seen an arc, where and when the ball will be, because there's only one place it, like, there's a time distance series, because you can catch it, here, etc. But competent jugglers will all agree, but incompetent jugglers won't. And I mean, most human beings are incompetent jugglers. So, like, that's the basic problem you run into with noesis of more complex things, is that you still know them. You're right. And I mean, the proof is in the fact that you don't drop the ball. Like, the ball hits your hand because you put your hand there to where the ball's going to be, and when the ball's going to be there, and hey, there's the ball in your hand. So you're right, and like, you're proven right in juggling, but most people wouldn't agree with you, and that can be deeply unsettling. And for a lot of people, maybe they'll never develop the courage for it. And there is the separate problem that you do have to have experience yourself to know the limits of your more complex knowledge like this. So, and this, sort of brings it back to kind of where I started when I said that, like, to some degree, I'm just describing the nature of wisdom, because wisdom is, knowing the limits of your knowledge. And remember, knowing the limits of your knowledge has both its extent and where it isn't. So you're knowing where your knowledge is and where your knowledge isn't. That's the nature of a limit. A limit is like, up to here, you do know, past here, you don't. So to know a limit is intrinsically to know that there is an area where the thing is true. That is to say, in this case, like, to know that there are things that you know. And there isn't a generic formulation for this. There isn't a generic answer, like, here is the limits of noesis. If you're on this side, you're good, and if you're on that side, you're not. You have to learn it for yourself. You have to learn, for example, anger is the perception of injustice, right? Now, like all perceptions, it can be based upon mistaken facts. Like, you can have misheard somebody and believe them to have said something that they didn't say, and then accurately perceive the injustice of what they didn't actually say. That is very much a doable thing. And so there, the limits of your knowledge are, you're right that you perceived an injustice. Like, the perception of injustice, that is to say, the anger, wasn't wrong, but the perception that it was based on was wrong. And so it's kind of complicated, because, like, when you ask, like, so, like, was the anger correct? Well, obviously not. It was not correct in total. It's not an accurate description. It is, that does not consist of an accurate description of the world, and so it can't be knowledge. Let's use the justified true belief definition of knowledge there, if you can't intuit what I mean by knowledge. It's not perfect, but good enough for the moment. So it's not knowledge in that sense, because you can't have incorrect knowledge. That's a contradiction in terms. And yet the problem is not in the perception of the injustice, but in the perception that this relied upon. And you can get very much a similar kind of thing, just looking optically speaking. You can miscount because you didn't quite see it right. You saw something else that looked like one of the things you're counting, but was not the thing that you're counting. So it is possible to make mistakes. And in the same way that it is possible to make mistakes with counting, now, we do have a very strong preference, you will notice, for having machines do the counting for us. Using a scale, like a scale that reads out the weight, because we trust those better than we trust ourselves to not make any mistakes. And we'll do this even when we have, like, I have a scale where, depending upon which way I lean, I can gain or lose almost half a pound. And yet I still trust the thing far more than I would trust myself to do other things. Like, it's interesting. So it's an interesting psychological point that I think is fairly common. So the point in this of, like, how do you draw that is, you do want to distinguish between, like, the parts that you're correct about, like what constitutes injustice. You may well be correct about, even though you're not correct that the thing actually happened. And it's the same kind of mistake as being entirely correct about the weight of a certain number of passengers on an airplane, but being wrong about like the actual weight on the airplane because you miscounted the number of passengers. It doesn't mean that like your multiplication figuring out the total weight on the airplane to make sure the airplane can hold it is wrong, or that you shouldn't trust that kind of thing. There's just the problem that you may misperceive the things that this depends upon. So part of what you need to do in this is to understand that sort of hierarchy of perception, like which perceptions depend upon other perceptions. And, so like your perception of the correctness of mathematics, for example, may well be very fundamental and lead you into error if you're putting in the wrong numbers into the mathematical calculations that you're doing, where you perceive them to be the correct calculations. Now, the issue with something like, anger, the perception of injustice, is that it depends on much more complicated things than mere counting does. Especially because often when we count, we make a point of getting close enough that it's very unlikely anything's going to get in our way. Whereas things like a perception of injustice, we don't have the leisure to control the circumstances under which we're doing the perceptions that we are basing our larger perceptions upon. So, now, what, again, since this is basically just describing that you need to be wise, if you look at how do wise people do this kind of thing, wise people will, for example, will have requirements on the base perception. So, for example, like the saying that the wise man always waits for the unedited video before reacting. Kind of a modern internet thing, but like you'll see stuff where a video is edited where person A does something really bad to person B, and then the video starts and person B defends themselves or responds, but it looks like person B is the aggressor, especially like if you cut it just right. Person A like relaxed for a moment after doing the aggressive thing, and then you see person B like looking aggressive at somebody who looks relaxed, and you assume this to be that a person was aggressive against somebody who was not aggressive. But when you see the full video and you see like what actually happened, you see who walked up to whom, for example, then you realize. So like that's an example, like that sort of aphorism, the wise man always waits for the unedited video before he has a reaction, or before he gives an opinion, say. That kind of thing is just like making sure, like you don't count the you don't take a measurement on a ruler from 60 feet away where you can barely see the ticks or the numbers. You come close enough to where you are confident there is nothing in your way. Similarly, it's the same kind of thing. Like you make sure to see enough of the context that you know that things are consonant with your, your interpretation of them, that your interpretation is correct. So like that's an example of, same thing, whether you're, measuring, how long something is with a ruler, or whether you are trying to measure, determine whether or not injustice occurred. You need to see enough of the context. You need to be sure that there are not things that are interfering with the primary perceptions upon which your later perception, your more composite perception is based. So like that's one of the things. And it doesn't change the nature of like which parts of this are you noetically perceiving. It just means that you have essentially like your perceptions are frequently composite perceptions. And so you need to be aware of what the underlying perceptions are. The underlying perceptions to measuring how long something is are like perceptions of color, right? Commonly, at least in the United States, measuring tapes are yellow with black lines because our eyes are really good at perceiving the contrast of that. So it's not universal, but it's really common. And so like your primary perceptions are yellow and black splotches in front of your eyes. And then you interpret these things into lines, and then you interpret these things, and other lines into numbers, and then you interpret these meanings. And so you have a composite perception of having seen that the thing was as long as 42 3/4 inches. Or, I don't know. I have no idea what that would be, but, 170 centimeters. I mean, those are obviously not the same measurement. But anyway, the point here being, though, that, like, you build each perception on the previous perception. And so you would say that, like, you saw the thing was, 42 3/4 inches long, because that is a perception. But it's a perception that itself derives from, other perceptions. And the thing is, like, those most basic perceptions are useless on their own. Like, just having a bunch of color does you no good. Like we don't live in a world of just like random, colors that aren't connected to each other and don't form patterns of actual things, because we interact with things. We don't interact with like sense perception of color or sense perception of frequencies or something like that. We interact with sense perceptions of like sounds, words and other such things. So that's one of the big things in terms of like trying to draw the limits of noesis, in the limits in both sense, like where it applies and where it doesn't. And I'd say another aspect of it is sort of what I've just alluded to, is realizing that all of the perceptions that we have, that we actually use in any sort of realistic sense, are all composite perceptions. Like, we're composite entities. The entities we interact with are composite entities. And this idea, which again kind of stems from the sort of, it has Martin Luther's fingerprints on it, of that desire for radical certainty, of trying to get to the most basic thing, that like, if you could get to the most basic thing, then you'd have something that everybody would agree on, and we would have certainty, and then we'll just base everything on that. But you can't. We don't live in the world of electrons and quarks and so on. We live in a world of composite entities. And so it's important to be realistic about that fact, that all perceptions we have that actually matter are, composite perceptions of composite entities based upon, other sort of, perceptions of constituent parts. Now, that's true whether, you're saying like, we see lots and lots of photons, that makes up an image, but that's also true of like, our perception of an interaction is made up of a collection of different components of that interaction. And so you have to be sure that you saw all of the components, or, heard, or, that you accurately perceived all of them. But it's important to be realistic that there is no like ground truth layer that you can get at that is in any way a more real perception than those more composite perceptions, as if you could like draw a line like, okay, only non-composite perceptions. If you tried doing that, you would have nothing but like noise. That's what the non-composite perceptions are, is just noise. So that too is important, to realize that you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to do this about, everything important in your life, is to analyze in terms of like all of my perceptions, all of my, thinking conclusions are based upon, these component things. And then, essentially that but the composite certainty is not some sort of simple addition to. That's probably kind of the final thing, is that like, it's not just like, oh, well, if there's one word I misheard, then, I don't know anything about the entire circumstance, because you can figure out what, there are many circumstances in which you can figure out large fractions of what was said. And if you know enough about the thing, that structurally there are only some possibilities. For example, like if you perceive an interaction lasting several minutes wherein two people are extremely angry at each other and are constantly hurling insults, and if in there's like one word out of everything was crystal clear, and you are extremely certain of this, you have the full context, and there's one word you can't quite make out whether or not it was an insult or a term of endearment. An insult spoken harshly or a term of endearment spoken sweetly. You can rule out the term of endearment because of the nature of the rest of it. That's not the structure of reality. That just does not happen. And that is something legitimate to do. That you do not... that provides the wiggle room for the sort of doubt that is the other face of the desire for radical certainty. But that, in fact, is not valid. Like that sort of desire for radical certainty, that sort of absolute doubt, that just needs to be overwhelmed by conviction. That's not appropriate. And it is a good idea to temper all of your conclusions with the understanding of your own fallibility. And so the practical way of doing that is within the framework of understanding what is good and what is evil, and essentially adjusting, tempering all of the things that you might do, so as, with regard to whether or not you might accidentally do, you may miss out on good or accidentally do evil. They're both important. There isn't one particular thing that you need to like always err on the side of. You need to balance them out. But the right way to deal with this is the right way to temper all of your conclusions with the knowledge that you are fallible is, again, the same thing, to understand the structure of reality and how things fit and what you can and can't rule out. And, to also bear in mind, like, there are limits to our knowledge. There are things we simply don't know, and if we don't know something, then doing good, or avoiding some sort of some sort of natural evil simply isn't given to us. Natural evil, things like, are things like destruction, death, ignorance, ugliness, and so on, as distinct from natural goods, like things like, wealth and beauty and strength, being well fed, things along, things coming to existence. Those are all natural goods. Moral goods are, about actions and about what you are seeking to do. Are you seeking to do, to create natural good? Are you seeking to create the natural goods that you should? Because you can do immoral things by achieving natural goods. I'm not going to go into that. That's an entire course in the nature of ethics. So I can't realistically summarize any of that here. But basically, you need to situate all of your knowledge within the framework of your knowledge of what is good and evil. And that will guide you in the what should you, what things should you be confident about and what things should you not be confident about. As well as all the other. So that is to say, do not ignore any of the levels of the hierarchy of this. And because that is the best guide to that. Because tempering all of your certainty with the knowledge of your own fallibility is a very high level, is in a very high level hierarchy, but it's not the highest. And there are higher level hierarchies beyond this. And so you need to temper even that with, the greater thing, the knowledge of the nature of the cosmos and what is good and evil and so on. So that's really the proper way to do it. Now, I know I'm being vague, but on the other hand, being specific would involve hours and hours worth of working through very difficult, complicated, and detail-filled examples, and that would only begin to scratch the surface. So I kind of just need to stay in generalities like that. So for those that it helped, there it is. And for those that didn't, I'm sorry that it's too general to be useful. So, that's some thoughts on the limits of skepticism and how unlimited skepticism destroys everything. So you need to figure out what are the limits of skepticism. And just like I said about the limits of gnosis, that means where should it be used as well as where shouldn't it, since the limit is the boundary of those two things. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.